Hi, my name is Vivian, and in this video I'd like to share with you how to skim read a nonfiction book so that you can take some insight and information with you out into the world without having to commit all of the time required to actually physically read the book from cover to cover. So before we get started with the 6-step process that I have for you to properly skim a book, and by the way, this is not just any book, this is nonfiction books. I do not have a technique for fiction or for poetry. I guess that's also nonfiction, but whatever, you know what I mean. So before we get started, why would you want to skim read rather than fully read a book? So for me, I was able to summarize that in 3 words, but I will elaborate a little bit briefly on all 3 of them. So the 3 main reasons are mortality, duty, and pleasure. Okay, so mortality. Obviously, if you are a book lover like myself, it is sometimes kind of depressing thinking about all of the books that you want to read, all of the books that you've ever had on your reading lists that you haven't ever gotten to and that you probably will never get to. So because of this, sometimes learning how to properly, effectively, maybe even one could say generatively or creatively read a nonfiction book can be one way out of that quagmire of sort of FOMO, right? So if you learn how to skim read a book, you can be exposed to a lot more books before the time of your death. So I know it's kind of extreme to put it in like mortality ways, but that is truly the ultimate deadline is your death, okay? Number 2, the word was duty. So the main reason you might have to read a book is because you have been assigned it in a class. And frequently, people procrastinate. We've all been there. We've all done it. So you might have been assigned several weeks to read a book, and now suddenly you've got one day ahead of you, and you've got a big important seminar coming up, and you're like, oh my goodness, I have no idea what this book is about. So obviously, you want to read the whole book in those situations, but sometimes it's like you just didn't make it. Who knows what got in the way, but it happens sometimes. So duty would be one of the reasons why you would want to learn how to skim a book so that you can make sure that you can still show up to the seminar, to the class, well prepared to discuss whatever the reading was, even if you're not necessarily thoroughly prepared in a cover-to-cover kind of way. And then finally, the 3rd reason was pleasure, and I would say this is actually very related to the mortality reason to skim read a book. But obviously, if you are just somebody who enjoys books, you want to derive a lot of pleasure, a lot of benefit, a lot of intrigue and information from them, but you know what, my eyes are bigger than my stomach. I always think I'm going to be reading a lot more than I'm actually able to commit to. This might be one way of coping with that sort of difference between what you want and what you can actually execute. Okay, so let's start going through the 6 steps I have for you for skim reading a book. Number 1 is very obvious. Choose the book. Now, this might be something that you have done, you're browsing in the library or the bookstore and you're like, that cover looks really interesting, or that title looks really interesting. That might be the way you choose the book to skim. In the case of the duty reason why you might skim read a book, you've already been assigned it. You don't really have to do any choosing. It's already been chosen for you. Okay, so step 1, choose the book. Step 2, read the front, back, and jacket covers. This is so obvious, I probably don't even need to explain why you should do it, but mainly it is the title, some intriguing elements, maybe even the book art has some clues as to what the book is about. And then of course the back cover in particular tends to have some kind of blurbs or summaries or sort of like invitations to read the book. And then of course in the inside covers you get a little bit more detail generally, and as well as sometimes an introduction to the author or authors. Okay, so that was step 2, read all the jacket covers, or just the covers of the book. Number 3, I don't know why I had to put the number 3 down with my hand, but okay, that's what I'm doing, I guess. Number 3 is what I would say is the absolute best part of skimming. It's a personal quirk of mine that I like to indulge in a lot, and I really recommend everybody use this in their lives way more often. So step 3 for skim reading a book is read the table of contents thoroughly. Okay? Step 3, read the table of contents thoroughly. This is something that can sometimes be the full outline of the argument of this nonfiction book. Okay? Sometimes it is incredibly thorough, sometimes the titles are really long, sometimes you get a lot of information even just from the table of contents. And in cases where it is actually a rather more simplistic or even enigmatic table of contents, just reading it can be kind of beautiful or exciting, maybe even poetic. The table of contents is a really cool way to sort of begin structuring in your own mind and predicting, what is this book going to be about? The table of contents is just a really important tool for nonfiction reading and skimming, and I think too few people really take advantage of that tool in their general exposure to books and information in the world. So that's why, for me, it's a personal quirk of mine. It's something I really enjoy doing. Like, every time I skim a book, that's like, sometimes if I'm really, really skimming and I barely read anything of the book, that's the part that I'm going to really, truly read. Okay, so that was step 3. Read thoroughly the table of contents. Moving on to step 4, this is where things get a little bit more in-depth. So in step 4, I recommend that you read the intro chapter or the first chapter. It kind of depends on the structuring of the book. So you don't have to read the whole thing. It kind of depends on how much time or commitment you're willing to put into it. So, but either way, I want you to read something from the first chapter. So if you are just in the bookstore or the library and you're like, I'm going to be here for like 4 minutes, I recommend just reading a paragraph or 2 from the first chapter. However, if you have a seminar coming up in a day or 2 and you have had like 4 weeks to read a book and then suddenly you're like, oh my goodness, I haven't read it yet, what am I going to do? Well, I would actually recommend reading the entire chapter, since you do have some time and you can make some really good insight and progress from reading the entire first chapter or introductory chapter. All right, step 5 in skim reading a nonfiction book. This is also I would say this is my second favorite element of skim reading, and that is choose a favorite chapter heading from the table of contents, one that intrigued you, confused you, you found bizarre. I don't know, there was some kind of attraction, let's say, in one of the middle chapters, and go over to that chapter and read at least a paragraph, or if you have a little bit more time or a little bit more commitment, read the entire chapter of whatever this one particular chapter was that you thought kind of stood out to you a little bit, seemed a little bit surprising, or maybe seemed really important to the overarching argument of the book as it seemed to you when you looked at the outline, which is the table of contents. All right, now finally we come to the final step, the 6th step in skim reading a nonfiction book, and that is read or skim, and by skim I mean, at least in this case, read the first paragraph of the final chapter, the conclusion, whatever the sort of closing argument chapter is. So this one, once again, the same rule as with steps 4 and 5. It kind of depends on how much time you have and how much commitment you are willing to give to this book relative to, how much reading you actually want to do. So let me just quickly re-summarize all 6 of those steps in like a shorter format. So step 1, choose the book. Step 2, read the front, back, and jacket covers. Step 3, thoroughly read the table of contents. Step 4, read either the first paragraph of the first chapter or the entire first chapter. Step 5, choose a chapter that most intrigued you, that is not the first chapter or the last chapter, that most intrigued you from the table of contents, and either read the first paragraph of that chapter, the first and last paragraph of that chapter, or the entire chapter. And then step 6, read either the first paragraph of the final chapter or the first paragraph in the final paragraph of the final chapter, or read the entire final chapter. Okay, so from this experience, from your practice, from your technique of skim reading a nonfiction book, you should be pretty well prepared to share some insights with others and to derive some personal benefits from the experience that you've just had. You do not have to be overwhelmed by... Oopsie. That's not what I was meaning to say. Let's see, what was I meaning to say here? Oh yeah, you will be really pleased by the efficiency of exposure to these new ideas. So often, we kind of have an either-or view of reading, and it's like, okay, I'm either going to read this cover to cover or I'm not going to read it at all. A lot of us have a sensation that we need to give total full attention to a book if we're going to read it. But the reality is we can't do that always. And so this is one way that you can sort of break it down into smaller pieces. And the way I like to think about it is that you're kind of shaking hands with the book, like, hey, book, nice to meet you. It's sort of a way of becoming an acquaintance, or making this book an acquaintance of yours, rather than a deep old friend like some of the books that you have in your life that you've probably read multiple times. So I'm thinking in my next video I'm probably going to demonstrate what this practice of skimming looks like so that you can see it in action and see how rich the experience of skim reading a book with these techniques can really be. So thank you very much for watching, and I'm new to YouTube, so if you have any comments or suggestions for me, I'm certainly curious and interested, and I'd love to hear from you, and please feel free to share any comments. Thanks, and hope to see and talk to you soon.